While my cousin, General Marcus, was serving overseas, our power-hungry HOA president, Karen, seized the opportunity to raze his time-honored family estate. Yet she never anticipated that he would return early, accompanied by a U.S. senator on speed dial. Can you believe that a mere property infraction set off a chain reaction that dragged half the HOA board into federal court and transformed our quiet suburb into a national scandal over veteran rights? I'll never forget that morning when I caught Karen Matthews snapping pictures of my cousin's house. She didn't bother to hide what she was doing. Instead, she stood in her designer workout clothes, her perfectly manicured nails tapping away on her phone. Those same hands had once approved her husband's construction company contracts, and now they were busy documenting what she called violations at Marcus's home. I stepped up to her, coffee still in hand, and asked, "Excuse me, Karen, but what exactly are you doing?" I had been watching her circle Marcus's colonial mansion from my kitchen window for the past 15 minutes, much like a vulture circling its prey. With an overly saccharine "good morning," a smile so fake it could have shattered glass, she replied, "I'm just documenting some serious maintenance issues. The paint is clearly 2 shades off from the approved HOA color scheme, and these hedges," she said, gesturing dramatically toward a meticulously trimmed shrub, "belong to my cousin's daughter and are maintained every weekend, standing at least half an inch above regulation." I exhaled deeply, remembering the advice General Marcus had instilled in me, to always keep cool. "Karen, Marcus is actively serving our country. He's a general, and this house has been in our family for 4 generations. Now listen," she retorted dismissively. "The paint was approved 3 years ago by the previous board, dear." She tapped away on her phone. "And deployment is no excuse for letting property values drop. Did you know the community center proposal could increase home values by 30%? That was the first time I'd heard about any community center." I continued to watch her snap more photos, my stomach churning as I recalled how the last 3 homeowners who dared stand up to her ended up with liens mysteriously placed on their properties. That afternoon, I combed through every HOA document I could find, even those tucked away in last month's meeting minutes. There, hidden among the pages, was a proposal for a state-of-the-art community center, set to be built right in the center of our block, exactly where Marcus's house stood. The following week became a blur of certified letters arriving at Marcus's home, each one citing another absurd violation. Suddenly, even the brass knocker, which had withstood 2 world wars, was declared non-compliant, and the rose bushes his daughter had planted before his deployment were labeled invasive species. I tried calling Marcus, but military communications were restricted during his current operation, so all I could do was send emails, uncertain whether he'd receive them in time. Every day, more HOA board members drove by, meticulously taking notes. I even installed security cameras after catching Karen's husband, Richard, measuring the property line at midnight with nothing but a flashlight for guidance. The final straw came when I saw Karen leading a group of suited investors on a tour of our street. I overheard her saying, "This entire area is going to be transformed. The outdated structures will be removed, starting with that eyesore," as she pointed directly at Marcus's house. That night, I called Marcus's daughter Lydia, who was away at college. "Something's not right," I confided. "I think they're planning something big, and your father's deployment makes his house an easy target." Her voice trembled as she replied, "But Dad is supposed to be home in 2 weeks. They can't just take our house. Our family photos, your mom's garden, everything is there." I longed to reassure her, but I knew Karen had already survived 3 lawsuits from other homeowners. She knew precisely how to manipulate the system. No sooner had I hung up than a certified letter arrived. The HOA was calling an emergency meeting for the following night to vote on the community center proposal. My heart nearly stopped when I read the fine print. The meeting was scheduled exactly 13 days before Marcus's return date, 1 day short of the 2-day notice mandated by federal law for deployed service members. It was then that I realized, with mounting horror, that Karen had planned this meticulously. This wasn't merely about property values or a community center. It was personal, and she had been plotting it for months. That night, I locked Marcus's front door, unable to shake the feeling that these might be the last few hours our family still owned this home. On the wall hung a photo of Marcus receiving his first command, a reminder that he had taught me battles are won with strategy, not brute strength. As I walked home, Karen's porch light flickered on. There she was, standing in her doorway in a silk robe, watching me with that signature cutting smile. "Better take some pictures," she called sweetly, "for the memories." Little did she know I was already devising a counter-strategy of my own. I awoke to the rumble of heavy machinery rolling down our street at 6:30 a.m. Through my bedroom window, I saw 3 yellow bulldozers and a large dump truck making their way straight toward Marcus's house. My heart pounded as I hurriedly put on my shoes and grabbed the folder of legal documents I'd been safeguarding ever since Karen began issuing threats. Barely had the morning fog lifted when I dashed outside in my pajamas, only to find Karen already there in her designer workout clothes, tapping on her iPad with that ever-present, insincere smile. 2 police cars were parked nearby, evidence that she had orchestrated every detail. "Stop!" I yelled, running toward her while clutching Marcus's deployment papers. "This house belongs to an active service member. You can't do this." My hands trembled as I held up the power of attorney documents that Marcus had entrusted to me. Karen just laughed and kept tapping on her iPad. "Oh, sweetie," she said without even looking up. "The board held an emergency meeting last night and voted unanimously for immediate demolition due to alleged severe structural issues." At last she looked up, her eyes turning icy. "It's all perfectly legal. We even have a report from a city inspector." I felt sick to my stomach. "What inspector? I've been here every day," I countered. The demolition crew chief, looking uncomfortable, shuffled over as I thrust Marcus's property tax receipts at him. "Everything's paid up. They can't do this." Karen stepped in between us. "Actually, we haven't received any tax payments for 6 months. What a shame." She then produced a thick folder. "We sent multiple notices. I suppose they were lost in the mail to wherever your cousin is stationed." My hands shook as I checked my banking app. There they were. 6 canceled checks to the HOA, all cleared by their bank. "You can cash these checks. I have proof right here." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Those payments were allocated to other outstanding violations. See these reports? Overgrown grass, unauthorized paint color, non-compliant mailbox height," she listed, as the sound of bulldozer engines grew louder. I called Marcus's lawyer while pacing on the sidewalk, repeatedly urging, "Pick up! Pick up! Pick up!" But the call went to voicemail, and the police officers on scene merely observed, saying they couldn't interfere in a civil matter. I felt utterly helpless as the demolition crew began setting up their equipment. Neighbors started emerging, drawn by the commotion. Most kept their distance, but elderly Mrs. Lynn from next door ambled over with her phone held high, recording every moment. "I remember when Marcus's grandparents built this house," she declared loudly. "Right after he came back from Korea, the whole neighborhood pitched in." Karen glared at her as the bulldozer's claw ascended, and I fought back tears. Then my phone rang. The screen showed Marcus's smiling face in full uniform. My hands trembled so badly, I nearly dropped it. "Hey, cousin," he said cheerfully. "You won't believe it. I managed to snag an early flight and just landed at the airport. I thought I'd surprise everyone." I stared in disbelief at the bulldozer creeping toward his front porch, the very spot where we once sipped lemonade in the summer, where his daughter learned to read and where his wife spent her final days. My voice cracked as I pleaded, "Marcus, you need to get here right now. Karen, they're about to—" But the crunch of splintering wood interrupted me as the bulldozer's claw took its first devastating bite out of our family's history. Behind me, Karen was already on her phone. "Yes, honey, they're starting now. Make sure your crew is ready to break ground for the community center next week." I asked, "And the permits?" She replied coolly, "Don't worry about those. I've got it all handled." The roar of the bulldozers drowned out everything else as I watched my cousin's life unravel before my eyes, praying he'd arrive in time. Little did I know that Karen's perfectly orchestrated plan was on the verge of spectacularly backfiring in ways none of us could have predicted. I'll never forget the morning sun glinting off the stars on the general's uniform as Marcus stepped out of my car. The bulldozer operator's face turned as white as a sheet, his hand frozen on the controls mid-action, while our grandparents' bay window, with its exquisite stained glass that our grandmother had chosen in 1962, lay shattered across the front lawn like broken dreams. At that moment, Karen was delivering a speech about community progress to a small gathering of neighbors when she noticed Marcus. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to deflate as he passed by without even a glance. The only sound was the crunch of his polished dress shoes over shards of broken glass and splintered wood. I watched, stunned, as my cousin, who had once faced down warlords and terrorists, stooped to retrieve his daughter Isabella's first ballet trophy from the debris. The golden plastic dancer was snapped in two, and he carefully tucked it into his uniform pocket. His face remained calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury I'd only seen once before, when he received the news about his wife's cancer. "Ma'am, I believe you're standing on my property," he said with composed military courtesy as he retrieved a weathered document from his briefcase. "This land deed dates back to 1947, when my grandfather returned from World War II. I'm curious, when exactly did the HOA acquire the right to demolish it?" Karen tried to regain her composure, brandishing her stack of HOA papers as though they were a shield. "The board's decision was unanimous. General, your cousin was duly informed. We have all the proper documentation," she insisted. Marcus held up his hand, and Karen froze mid-sentence, like a schoolgirl caught passing notes. He pulled out his phone, pressed a number on speed dial, and waited while the gathered neighbors leaned in, eager to catch every word. "Ben? Yes, it's Marcus," he said. "Remember that talk we had about local government overreach?" He continued, pausing to fix his gaze on Karen. "Well, you won't believe what I'm seeing right now. Yes, that property, the one my grandfather willed to me, which is protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act." Karen's face shifted from red to pale as Marcus mentioned the federal law safeguarding deployed service members' property rights. But it was his next words that made her clutch her designer purse as if it were a lifeline. "Yes, Senator Thompson, I think your committee would be very interested in how the HOA handled this situation." He listened for a moment before adding, "That's very thoughtful of you, Ben. See you in an hour." Meanwhile, the demolition crew was already retreating, offering excuses about lunch breaks and wrong addresses. Karen's husband, Richard, whom I had seen earlier boasting at the mailbox about his company's guaranteed contract for the new community center, suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Marcus walked the perimeter of his devastated home, snapping photos on his phone. He paused at his daughter Isabella's bedroom, or what was left of it. The walls were still standing, but the roof was gone. Isabella's space posters fluttered in the breeze like surrender flags, and the sight of her NASA-themed bedsheets mingling with shattered roof tiles tightened my throat. A young woman stepped forward from the crowd and addressed him. "Sir, I have videos of everything. They began at dawn, completely ignoring your cousin's legal documents," she said, casting a nervous glance at Karen. I recalled Mrs. Matthews on the phone last night, insisting that the demolition had to be done before anyone returned. Then more neighbors emerged, offering cell phone videos, copies of emails, and meeting minutes. It was as if a dam of long-held fear had burst open. Everyone had a story about Karen's threats and the HOA's bullying, though no one had dared speak up until now. Marcus thanked each person, meticulously recording their contact details with the same precision he used in planning military operations. I could almost see a strategy forming behind his eyes. He hadn't just come home to a demolished house. He'd stepped into a war zone of small-town politics and corruption. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing ever closer. Karen's phone buzzed with a news alert, and her face went from pallid to ashen as she read it. The local news had already picked up the story. A decorated general's home demolished while he was deployed, and the HOA was under federal investigation. Marcus straightened his uniform and addressed the growing crowd of neighbors, many holding up their phones to record. "My grandfather built this house with his own 2 hands after fighting for our country," he began. "He taught me that some things are truly worth fighting for, even if the battlefield is in your own backyard." He smiled, though it wasn't a happy smile. "I do believe the real estate lawyers are about to arrive, Karen. I hope you kept proper records." I caught sight of Karen's Mercedes peeling out of her driveway, her designer purse abandoned on our demolished front steps. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He had that determined look, the same look he'd had before leading his most successful missions. In a quiet tone, he added, "Let's talk about the peculiar pattern of contracts awarded to board member companies over the past 5 years. I never expected to see 6 news vans vying for parking spots on our once quiet street, but that's exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong general." The morning had begun with Senator Thompson striding up our driveway, as though preparing for battle. One glance at the rubble of Marcus's home prompted him to pull out his phone and bark, "Get me the state attorney general!" At that moment, Karen emerged from her house in a designer bathrobe, her face as pale as chalk, her usual smirk completely gone. "This is a private HOA matter," she squeaked, but no one listened. 2 police cars soon arrived, and I watched as Karen stumbled backward when officers began photographing the destruction. A small smile crept onto my face when Marcus retrieved the folder I had safeguarded. Inside were copies of every check he'd sent to the HOA, along with certified mail receipts proving that Karen had received them. "Funny how all these payments went missing," he remarked steadily, his voice calm. The detective scribbling in his notebook didn't seem amused in the least. Then came the real bombshell. A young intern from Senator Thompson's office, who had been combing through public records all morning, rushed up with a stack of papers. "Sir, you need to see this," she exclaimed. The documents revealed that Karen's husband's construction company had won the bid for the community center 3 months before the HOA had even voted on the project. Reporters were having a field day. One discovered that Karen had sent violation notices to 3 other deployed service members' homes in the past year, while another found that she had tried to force an elderly couple out last summer, claiming their garden gnomes were destroying property values. Marcus stood amidst the chaos, still in uniform, assisting the forensics team in salvaging what they could from his crushed home. He didn't rage or shout like Karen, who was now furiously screaming at her husband on his phone from the driveway. Instead, he carefully placed each recovered photograph into a metal evidence bag, explaining the story behind each one to the growing crowd of supportive neighbors. Then, Karen made her gravest error. She marched over, waving a hefty HOA rulebook. Page 394 clearly states that the board possesses emergency powers to remove hazardous structures, she shouted. The crowd fell silent. Slowly, Marcus turned to her, and in that moment I understood why he had risen to the rank of general. "Karen," he said quietly, "my great-grandfather built this house when he returned from World War II. He used his own 2 hands to lay these bricks, and you have just crushed that legacy. Pray tell, what was the emergency?" She gaped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as cameras rolled and everyone waited in anticipation. Then Ben, our longtime mailman, stepped forward. "I have something you all need to see," he announced, pulling out his phone. He had recorded a video the day before of Karen and her husband walking around Marcus's property, measuring and marking spots while discussing where the gym would go. "This was all done before any vote took place," Ben declared. Just then, the state attorney general arrived. As Karen's husband, Richard, pulled up in his Mercedes, he took one look at the scene and tried to drive away, only to find a police car already blocking his exit. Inside his briefcase, authorities found the undeniable evidence. Blueprints for the community center dated 2 months before Marcus's house was even marked for demolition. But Karen wasn't finished. She played one final, desperate card that none of us saw coming. She produced a document that turned Marcus's face ashen. A document that could change everything. Yet that twist would have to remain a mystery for now. The crowd of neighbors swelled as news helicopters circled overhead. Amid the chaos, Marcus's teenage daughter, Olivia, arrived home from school. Standing at the edge of what used to be her bedroom and clutching her backpack, she asked the question that would soon captivate the internet. "Dad, where are all my letters from when you were deployed?" At that moment, I watched Karen's face turn ghostly white as FBI agents entered the emergency HOA meeting. She tried to grab her designer purse and flee, but the agents had blocked both exits. Not even her impeccable makeup could hide her panic as they began reading emails from her personal laptop. Emails that revealed she had been hiding Marcus's tax payments for months while her husband's construction company prepared to build the community center. "This is ridiculous!" Karen screamed, leaping up from her chair. "We followed all the rules!" But then Agent Thompson played a recording of her phone call with the demolition company. "I don't care if the paperwork isn't final yet. Tear it down before he gets back. We'll sort out the details later." The entire room gasped. Mrs. Robinson, who had been our next-door neighbor for 20 years, began to cry. "You told us he abandoned the property," she accused, addressing Karen. "You claimed his taxes hadn't been paid in years." Meanwhile, Marcus stood silently in the corner, still in uniform, clutching his daughter's cracked ballet trophy. He had spoken not a word since the agents arrived. The evidence said it all. The FBI uncovered a slew of damning evidence: fake violation notices, board meetings that never happened, and even checks from Marcus that Karen had hidden in her home office. Outside, local news crews were having a field day as headlines like "Decorated General Faces Federal Charges in Veteran Property Scheme" flashed across every TV screen. Senator Thompson ensured that this story wouldn't be buried, but the biggest shock came when they arrested Karen's husband, Richard, at his office. It turned out that the community center plans included luxury condos that would have netted them millions. They had been orchestrating this scheme for years, targeting the homes of deployed service members who couldn't fight back. The following weeks became a blur of lawyers, reporters, and building inspectors. 7 HOA board members faced criminal charges, and Karen, along with her husband, were staring at serious prison time for fraud and for violating the Service Members Civil Relief Act. They had certainly messed with the wrong family. Yet the real victory wasn't simply watching Karen being led away in handcuffs or her house being sold when she could no longer afford her fancy lawyers. The true triumph was witnessing our community come together to set things right. Veterans from 3 states arrived with tools and supplies. Local businesses donated materials. Even the mayor came by to help lay the foundation for Marcus's new home, the colonial style that Karen despised. The Historical Society fast-tracked protection for that home along with 6 other veteran-owned properties in our neighborhood. Today, I sit on Marcus's new front porch, watching his daughter Madeline practice ballet in the yard. The house closely resembles the old one, but it's been rebuilt with love by people who truly understand the meaning of service and sacrifice. There's even a new wall in the kitchen, where Madeline's height marks are etched next to a shadow box holding the salvaged pieces of the old house. We managed to stop Karen's community center from ever materializing. Instead, that land has been transformed into a memorial park honoring local veterans. Sometimes when I walk by, I see families enjoying picnics where Karen once planned to build luxury condos. Madeline delights in the playground equipment donated by the very construction companies that rejected Karen's dubious contracts. Marcus never brags about how he brought down a corrupt HOA board. He simply smiles when new neighbors ask about the small piece of his old front door hanging beside his medals. It's a reminder that home is always worth fighting for. The FBI investigation is still ongoing, and similar schemes have been uncovered in other neighborhoods. But what truly struck me was this. Just last week, I saw Karen's son, Nathan, helping out at the Veterans Food Bank downtown. He looked me in the eye and said, I'm sorry for what my parents did. Perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. A reminder that sometimes justice comes with a chance for healing. I never expected our story to change so many lives, but that is exactly what happened. After a video of Karen's arrest went viral, my phone began ringing non-stop with calls from military families across the country, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Over morning coffee, Marcus looked at me and said, "We need to help them all." Although the news crews might have left our street, we were just getting started. With Marcus's military connections and my experience documenting Karen's schemes, we formed the Homeowners Defense Alliance. Every week, more veterans joined our cause, sharing their own battles against unfair HOA boards that tried to bully them while they served overseas. Karen's replacement on the HOA board, a retired Marine named Mike, discovered something intriguing in the old files. Our neighborhood wasn't the only target. Karen's husband's construction company had been eyeing properties in 3 other military communities, employing the same pattern of sudden, strict enforcement of minor violations, lost paperwork, and swift demolition votes, all while homeowners were deployed. I watched Marcus transform our dining room into a command center, with maps of HOA trouble spots pinned to every wall. Senator Thompson even began drafting new laws to protect military families from predatory HOA practices, and they named it the Matthews Act. And yes, we made sure that Karen's name would forever be linked to the solution, not just the problem. The real surprise came one afternoon when Karen's teenage daughter, Melanie, visited us. She was in tears, clutching a box of old photos she'd rescued from our dumpster before the demolition. "Mom never told me these were in there," she whispered, handing Marcus a dusty album of his daughter's baby pictures. "We had thought those memories were lost forever. Sometimes good things come from unexpected places." Last week, we celebrated the first victory of our Homeowners Defense Alliance. A young Army nurse from Texas called after her child had struggled to reclaim the $100 per day for a flagpole her late father had installed before deployment. Marcus made some calls. I drafted a few letters, and suddenly, that HOA board wasn't so brave anymore. The flag still flies, and now there's a precedent for others to follow. Remember that community center Karen once desired so desperately? The land now sits empty, but not for long. Marcus donated it to create affordable housing for veterans transitioning back to civilian life, with the first families moving in next month. And guess who volunteered to help them settle? Karen's daughter, who now says she wants to make things right. People ask me if I'm still angry about what happened, but honestly, I'm grateful. Without Karen's greed, we might never have discovered how many military families needed help. We might never have built this amazing community of supporters who look out for one another while our heroes serve overseas. And Marcus's daughter might never have learned that sometimes losing your home paves the way for building something even better. Speaking of Marcus, he just walked in with another stack of case files and that determined look in his eyes. "There's a retired Navy SEAL in Florida whose HOA is trying to ban his service dog," he remarked. "Let's just say Karen taught us exactly how to deal with bullies who mess with the wrong veterans. Want to guess how this one ends?"